Pan-African Review is a platform that challenges assumptions about Africa and a space for introspective perspectives on matters of concern to Africans. Hello and welcome to the Pan-African Review podcast. This is your online spot for African discourse. I am your host, Mahatma Ulimwengu, and today we have a wonderful show for you. Our guest today is Soha Benchekroun. She's an engineer by training, specialized in strategy with experience in international cooperation and management consulting. She's an independent researcher in sustainable development. Her research interests include alternative societal and business models, frugal technology, and social and environmental justice with a focus on Africa and the emerging South. And if you like this, guys, please do press like, share, subscribe, send this to your family and friends, and we will be back with Soha Benchekroun.
We're going to discuss your article in the Pan-African Review, Climate Sustainability for Whom. So just starting off, tell us how climate guidelines from Western governments and multinational consulting firms create negative impacts on the African continent.
Yes, indeed, Western governments, some international organizations, and big consulting firms supports climate and environmental guidelines that can harm Africa's interests and priorities simply because it does not go in the direction of the continent's most pressing challenges that are above all socio-economic development challenges.
Right.
Of course, when we say Africa, the African continent, there are many different realities, but there is something several African countries have in common, is the urgent need to break away from aid dependence, from widespread poverty, and be able to benefit from the abundant natural resources they have. This should be the priority, which is not necessarily reflected by certain climates and environmental guidelines that rather advance Western agenda in most cases at the expense of Africa. That's unfortunate, but at the same time, not very surprising. Western parties look after Western interests. It is up to Africa to look after its own interests. This is true for everything, the climate and sustainability area included. So nobody is in a position, least of all those who are historically responsible for global greenhouse gas emissions, nobody's in a position to say to Africa, look, basically this is how you become a green, planet-friendly continent. Nice words, and one can't be against being sustainable. But wait a minute, what does this really mean for Africa? If in one way or another this can be a hindrance to African populations' access to electricity, and 600 million people still don't have access, or if it is an obstacle to the continent's much needed industrialization, then it is a problem. Let's remember that the share of African manufacturing industry in global production is less than 2%, all of Africa. How can we break away from aid dependence if we do not have our own factories for local transformation?
Okay, so you wrote and spoke about the need for Africa to break away from the vicious circle of aid dependence and poverty. How is that related to climate change guidelines promoted by these Western governments and these international consulting firms?
Yeah, you know, experts say and decision makers also understand today that the industrial developments in the continent cannot be reached using only renewables. No other industrialized country ever did it with renewable energy only. That's why African green transition should be based on African models, taking into account the African specific realities and priorities. I'll give you an example of a country I lived in, Guinea, Conakry, one of the richest countries in the world in terms of mineral resources. You have the world's biggest reserves of bauxite, not to mention iron reserves. But at the same time, one of the poorest countries worldwide, if you take human development, poverty levels, etc. So when you see people and young people in precarious situations in this country, you can't help thinking, what would have been the fate of these people if the country had a strong national industry and was able to exploit its own mineral wealth. This is where you understand actually that Guinea, like many other resource rich African countries with very high poverty rates and wide inequalities, these countries actually do not need aid. They do not need inappropriate narratives about getting green or contributing to the global net zero transition, while their contribution actually to global emissions is ridiculously low. What
Right.
they need, above all, is industrial development, strong national industries, factories, creating jobs, and redirecting mining revenues to the benefit of local populations. Um, of course, this threatens somehow the interests of Western powers. The colonial and neo-colonial interests would want African countries to remain eternal raw material producers. But this has to change, and this is changing already. Um, if you want another example, speaking of dependence, when you go to the supermarkets in most sub-Saharan countries, you find expensive imported products that the average local consumer cannot afford. Uh, Take the juice in Guinea, just to get the idea. Does it
Right.
make sense to have pricey pineapple juice of European brands when you have the best pineapples grown locally and in abundance, and you have water? Guinea is called the water tower of West Africa. This is just one example, in one country, but it's the same paradox for most important products in the region. So as long as there is no strong industrial development, meaning no or very little local transformation, there will continue to be economic aberrations of all kinds.
Right.
Um, yeah. So just to come back maybe to your question, breaking away from these patterns, sorry, requires uh, strong industrial policies and frameworks, as we just said, but it also requires, obviously, political sovereignty. And this change is happening. The world can see it, can see the impulse of a new Africa rejecting all forms of neocolonialism and starting to develop African specific models. These are, of course, complex transformations that won't happen overnight, but we feel that it comes from a shared desire for real developments, a shared desire for emancipation, like what we are witnessing in West Africa recently, uh, mainly driven by the young African generation that is aware of the
Right.
continent's potential, but also its challenges and paradoxes.
Right. So you mentioned earlier that Africa's contribution to the climate crisis is not nearly as much as these international corporations and these Western governments. So the issue of climate change and the discussion about it has been around for decades, and it's been ubiquitous for decades now. If anything, like we've gone in the opposite direction in terms of where we need to be heading towards in terms of global emissions. So what can Africa do? What can African states do? You mentioned political sovereignty. What can these independent states do to reverse this trend without compromising its industrialization? Is there a role for Africans to play?
Mm. Indeed, the climate crisis, as you say, is real and known since decades. It is clearly caused by the Western consumerist, capitalist, and extractivist model of society, whose fundamental mechanisms are against the very basics of sustainability.
Right.
Now, if humanity wants to stay within a habitable temperature on Earth, these industrialized nations urgently need to make a shift that should have been made a long time ago, actually, in the way they produce, the way they consume, towards more frugality. The kinds of energy they use, they are still heavily dependent on fossil fuels, despite all the talking about clean energy. Now,
Right.
coming to Africa, that has the socioeconomic challenges we've been talking about, and as you say, that has a very low contribution to global emissions, around 3% for all the continents. Um, Common sense dictates that it is up to Africans again to decide how to manage their energy mix. It is true that many of them have a big renewable energy potential that should be used, and you have already, African countries that are leaders in renewable energy, like Ethiopia, with more than 90%, I think, of their energy mix. Morocco has big ambitions also when it comes to renewable energy, and others as well. But in general, the gradual phase out from fossil fuels in the continent must be dealt with in a just and equitable manner, considering the energy needs and development context of each country. And more and more voices are raised from experts, civil society, some political leaders, saying that is immoral to pursue climate goals on the backs of the poor people in the world. So this is climate justice, and the meaning of sustainable development cannot be separated from this. Because again, as Africans, we cannot afford to miss the industrial takeoff of our countries. Africa has a huge potential. It's the world's youngest population, the world's largest labor pool by 2050. It's a third of the world's reserves of all minerals combined, 60% of the world's unused arable land. But at the same time, without proper industrial development, we obviously remain trapped in the vicious circle of excessive importation of finished products, very little local processing, and exportations with no or low value, added value, which always leads to poverty, more poverty, and inequalities. Yeah, so maybe to quickly get back to your question about Africa reversing the trend, there is another important point is that Africans, in my opinion, should never see the Western consumerist lifestyle as something desirable. I believe on the opposites, the world has a lot to learn from African ways of being and ways of innovating. Innovate whenever there is a real need or necessity to be met, and just not. I mean, not just running behind superfluous needs, because it is precisely the outrageous consumerism and productivism that inevitably leads to ecological disaster. And this is the reason why we live on ecological credits, meaning that humanity has already used more resources than it can regenerate per year. So Africa, of course, needs to pursue its development and industrial development goals, but its own way, not necessarily following the consumerist style society. And this is something Africa, I mean, we've seen it during the COVID crisis, how African people use their ingenuity to come up with innovative solutions the African way, despite scarcity, the solar powered hand washers and other examples, how African people know, how they manage the scarcity that the world will be more and more confronted with. So this ability to do better with less is, I believe, an important part of the solution when it comes to sustainability.
Okay, so I'm just going to read from the article here, just a quick quote. You write, quote, pursuing climate ambitions on the backs of the poorest people in the world is not just hypocritical, it is immoral, unjust, and green colonialism at its worst. That's a quote from Vijaya Ramachandran, the Director for Energy and Development at the Breakthrough Institute. So just, we've touched upon this already, but just walk us through, how does green colonialism work in practice and implementation, specifically on the African continent?
Mm. Yes, so this can have many facets. Green colonialism can have many manifestations. The first one is what you mentioned with the quote of Vijaya. It's what we discussed, pursuing global decarbonation objectives on the backs of vulnerable people that first need to access electricity and escape poverty, or to the detriment of a country's industrial development. This is green colonialism. One, there is a second facet. It can be through the eviction of local and indigenous populations from their ancestral lands under the pretext of nature conservation. This is also considered as green colonialism. So there is a sort of colonial myth, about the African nature that Guillaume Blanc describes in his book on the subject. It's based on this conception of an ever wild African nature. Based on this, foreign institutions sometimes consider local communities as a threat to their own environments, and they can recommend, through international experts, the eviction of these communities from their lands, and this can be to the benefit of elite tourism, for example.
Where does that take place? The eviction of land. Is that which country specifically is that very prevalent?
Yeah, it takes place. It takes place, of course, in many African sub-Saharan countries. Yes, and this can be for for elite tourism, or and there is a whole process and system that
Sophisticated, you know?
tries to justify it precisely through international experts, etc. And I find this ironic, as very often these communities actually are inspiring models of frugal way of living in harmony with nature. Sorry, and in fact, they are, and these very same communities are themselves victims of the damage caused by multinational corporations, etc.
Right.
Yes. So this is a second, you can find other examples of green colonialism. For example, what we call green resources or critical minerals for the green transition. If you take the green transition supply chains, the logic is to produce more smartphones, more electric vehicles. The world needs those so-called critical minerals. But as you know, the mining of these resources is associated with child labor, poor conditions, environmental destruction, conflicts. If you take what's happening in Congo with cobalt,
Yeah.
yeah, so that's an example. The issue here is, what we do not question enough is, do we really need more smartphones? Are electric vehicles really the sustainable solution? And this is where, when we talk about techno-solutionism, meaning you take a technology solution to every problem in the world, including climate. And this is not necessarily the way to go. It's been criticized since some time. Don't we need to simply produce and consume less individual vehicles,
Yeah, but
less
that's
smart?
not going to happen, is it? At this rate. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, and especially in these developed nations
But that's the
where
thing with
you've
climate change. Sorry to interrupt. That's the thing with climate change. Every time I do a little bit of research on climate change, you go back to videos in the 1980s of people saying, by 2002, we need to have done this. And then obviously they didn't do it. And now, 20 years after 2002, we're still saying the exact same things. So I'm like, what's actually happening? Clearly, nobody really cares about it. It's just a bunch of virtue signaling.
yeah, yeah, exactly. It's because the global trend is goes in another direction. We need always, I mean, with this system we live in, this capitalist machine is not ready to hear seriously questions like, let's use less smartphones,
Right.
less smart technology. This is something that the capitalist machine is not ready to hear, and as long as it's the case, I'm afraid there can continue to be false ambitions, as what you just described. There continue to be dire conditions in African mines. Why is that? For the world to produce even more smartphones, whose toxic electronic waste will be dumped downstream again, in countries of the south, in Africa, for example, which is another disastrous impacts. So yeah, very often the realities behind the zero net transition, supply chains, and the technological overconsumption are actually neither green nor sustainable, and instead they even worsen the resource exploitation issues. So yeah, these are just some facets of green colonialism. Maybe there is one other one that crosses my mind now. It's uh, recent studies showing that the biggest share of climate aid to Africa goes through uh, non-African but Western-based organizations and consulting companies. So uh, we are far from this stated localization aims of localization. And this can be also considered as a manifestation of green colonialism.
Okay. So, just to summarize everything we've been saying, Western capitalists are often at fault for our global ills, including the pollution and damage to our society and environment. The US military is the greatest emitter of CO2. And a few months ago, there was that issue with the Nord Stream 2 pipeline from Russia to Germany, which they claimed the Ukrainians did it, but obviously the US military did. That was the greatest emission of methane gas in the history of the world. And nobody even mentions that. Greta Thunberg doesn't want to address that aspect of pollution and that aspect of CO2 emissions. So why do you think it has been so difficult to address the impact of these multinational corporations on our climate? And obviously the US is, their military is funded in large part. They represent these military contractors and the oil and gas companies. So they are pretty much a part of the multinational corporations. Why do you think it's been so hard to discuss that issue on a public space?
Mm. I think from a global perspective, in very simple terms, this is linked, as you mentioned, to interests of very powerful corporations,
Right.
primarily in fossil fuel production. And this is what delayed the adoption of policies to transition to clean energy and limit global warming, because this issue we knew about it since decades, but it was delayed and delayed again. Now, if we want to talk about these multinational corporations operating in Africa, because that's also an important issue. Definitely, it's a question of balance of power. That's why it's important to have strong national institutions and framework to arbitrate, right? To ensure that there are fair approaches to social and environmental issues. And why not to require technology transfers? Uh, there are some efforts underway in some African countries. There needs to be more, obviously. If you take the mining sector, which is very relevant to the African context, the private operators, they can no longer come exploit Africa's resources, rake in benefits, and leave behind considerable damage, yeah,
Yeah.
to communities and their environments. This mindset is no longer acceptable and is contrary to the basics of sustainable development. There needs to be serious corporate social responsibility, and the states have a role to ensure that the private sector is serious about these commitments to the population and environment where it operates, and not only using CSR narratives for, PR or basic compliance certifications to have the go from investors. But things are changing also in the mining sector, where there has been a wave of renegotiations of mining agreements in many countries like Guinea, we were mentioning, like DRC, so that the mining revenues contribute to the development of public services and benefit the populations, and not only the profitability of private companies, because these private companies definitely need to be pushed to give priority to employing local workers in decent conditions, and need to be pushed to create social projects, environmental projects that are likely to contribute to positive development. In an ideal world, these private companies shouldn't only be repairing the damages and excesses caused by their activity, but also taking part in a certain social construction, in the country where they operate, to truly contribute to a positive development.
Yeah, that's in an ideal world only, unfortunately. For now,
True.
I guess.
True.
Right. So, in closing, what role should an independent African state play in the upcoming struggle to redefine what it means to be sustainable and sustainability itself?
Yeah. Yeah, I think there is an important word in what you just said is the independence and sovereignty. A country needs solid institutions to provide and maintain the socio-economic infrastructure required for sustainable development, um, but also to initiate policies to protect its citizens from the impacts of climate change. It's what we call climate adaptation. This is very important to Africa, as many countries are recently hit by cyclones, by droughts, by rainfall deficits, floods, as a result of the climate crisis. Now, only sovereign and strong countries can provide the necessary infrastructure and necessary systems to protect their citizens from these devastating effects. Let me give the recent tragic example we've seen in Libya last September with the horrific floods. It's been proven by scientists that this storm was amplified by the climate crisis. Libya, as you know, that was once a prosperous country, and that turned after 2011 to a very fragile, subjugated state, incapable of providing safety to its citizens, much less sustainable development or climate adaptation plans. I believe this tragic example must be a call for Pan-African alliances to advance regional sustainable development agenda, more Pan-African alliances with a focus on climate adaptation. That is really crucial today. There is a need that African countries unite and combine their efforts, as this is a common threat that knows no borders. So African unity is, something that we can hope for everything, and it's very relevant also in the climate area. South-South cooperation in general, in all its forms, is key, especially since the global South is the most affected by the effects of climate change. Redefining sustainability in Africa, in my opinion, is first about decolonizing the sustainability discourse and seeing it through an African lens with regard to the continents and each African country's priorities. Far from false problems, far from a certain naive advocacy for a green Africa that can be sometimes sustainable for others, but not necessarily for Africans.
All
We
right.
keep in touch.
Have a good day.
Have a nice Sunday as well. Talk to you soon.
Cheers. Take care.
Keep in touch. Take care. Cheers. Bye.
Thank you very much for sticking with us till the end. Be sure to check out our website at panafricanreview.com, and we will see you guys in the next episode.